Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another plunge into the murky depths of, well, human nature.
Always up for a good deep dive.
Today, we're tackling a figure who sparked endless debate, Martin Shkreli, aka Pharma Bro.
Ah, Shkreli. A name that evokes strong reactions, to say the least.
Exactly. Is he a visionary entrepreneur? A heartless manipulator? Or, as is often the case, something in between? That's what we're here to unpack. We've combed through a mountain of material, articles from CNN, BBC, The Independent, court documents, The Wall Street Journal, even The Atlantic. Everyone's trying to make sense of this guy.
What fascinates me about Shkreli is this juxtaposition of, well, undeniable brilliance on one hand, and some seriously questionable ethical choices on the other.
It's that tension that makes him so fascinating to dissect, right?
Absolutely.
His story starts in finance, explodes in the pharmaceutical world, and ultimately lands him in court. And all along the way, he's playing this very public, very provocative game.
It's like he almost engineered his own rise and fall, very deliberately.
So let's rewind to 2015. Shkreli, at this point the CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals, makes a decision that catapults him into infamy. He jacks up the price of Daraprim.
Daraprim, for those who don't know, is used to treat a parasitic infection.
And not just a little price hike, we're talking a staggering increase.
Overnight, it goes from $13.50 a pill to $750.
Over 5,000%. The public outrage was immediate and intense.
Understandably so. This wasn't some niche drug. This was a medication that people relied on, often those with compromised immune systems.
It sparked protests, congressional hearings. Shkreli even becomes the poster boy for corporate greed.
And his behavior during those hearings, well, let's just say it didn't help his image.
Smirking, dismissive, refusing to answer questions.
He later called lawmakers imbeciles.
Yeah, not a good look.
Oh.
But in the midst of all this, Shkreli offered a defense for the price hike.
He claimed it was necessary to fund research and development for better treatments.
A common argument from pharmaceutical companies, right?
It is. But the thing is, with Daraprim, that argument falls apart. Because Daraprim was a generic drug, it wasn't some groundbreaking new invention requiring massive R&D spending.
It had been around for decades, readily available.
Exactly. So to many, that defense felt hollow. A convenient excuse to line his own pockets.
And this Daraprim controversy was just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Shkreli's legal troubles. In 2017, he gets convicted on multiple counts of securities fraud.
This wasn't about drug prices anymore. This was about straight-up financial deception.
Right, relating to his hedge fund management. Essentially, misleading investors about his fund's performance.
Using one company as a personal piggy bank to pay off debts in another. A pretty serious offense.
So walk us through this. How does a scheme like that work, and why is it illegal?
Imagine it like this. You're constantly taking in new money, not to generate actual profits, but to pay off older investors. It's a house of cards.
Oh, I see.
And that's essentially what Shkreli was doing, taking from Peter to pay Paul, assuring everyone his funds were doing great when in reality...
It was all smoke and mirrors.
Exactly. The Department of Justice called it a Ponzi-like scheme, a sophisticated form of theft built on deception, and it can have devastating consequences, especially for those who invested their life savings.
Okay, so the facade crumbles, he's found guilty. What were the repercussions?
7 years in prison, ordered to forfeit $7.4 million in assets,
Wow.
and a lifetime ban from working in the pharmaceutical industry. It was a significant fall from grace for someone who was once considered a Wall Street whiz kid.
A true Shakespearean tragedy. But even with all this going on, Shkreli seemed to relish the attention. Remember his behavior in court? Refusing to answer questions, smirking at the jury. It was bizarre.
He seemed to thrive on antagonizing those in authority.
And that carried over into his online presence, too.
Oh, absolutely.
His live streams, Twitter feuds, the whole persona was this strange mix of bravado, trolling, and sometimes even genuine insight.
It was almost performance art.
Playing video games in his pajamas, ranting about his enemies. He even endorsed Donald Trump and offered money for a strand of Hillary Clinton's hair.
It was. A lot.
He really mastered the art of using social media to cultivate a very specific, very controversial image.
One of the earliest examples of someone doing that so effectively.
And speaking of controversy, we can't forget about the Wu-Tang Clan album.
Once Upon a Time in Shaolin, a legendary piece of music history.
In 2015, Shkreli drops $2 million to buy this one-of-a-kind album. The whole point was that it would never be released publicly, a statement against music streaming and piracy.
And what does Shkreli do?
Plays snippets of it online.
Boasts about having MP3 copies.
Completely disregards the artistic intentions behind the album. Classic Shkreli.
Flouting the rules, stewing the pot.
It, of course, led to another lawsuit.
This time, with the group that sold him the album, it makes you wonder, was it a calculated act of provocation or a genuine love for the music? It's hard to tell with Shkreli. His motives are always a bit of a puzzle.
That's what keeps us coming back for more, right? Trying to crack the code of Martin Shkreli.
It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while it's simultaneously on fire.
Exactly. But before we dive deeper into that enigma, we need to take a quick break. Stay with us.
We'll be right back. It's interesting how Shkreli's story really ties into that whole debate about government regulation in the pharmaceutical industry.
He became the face of it almost, didn't he?
Yeah, like a lightning rod for the whole issue of drug pricing. I mean, that Daraprim price hike, it really threw fuel on that fire.
Definitely. I mean, people were already concerned about the rising cost of medications.
And then, bam, this guy comes along and just embodies everything they were worried about.
It gave those arguing for more government oversight a perfect example.
They said, look, this is what happens when companies are allowed to prioritize profit over patients.
A classic market failure, they argued. Essential medications should be affordable, accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford exorbitant prices.
Right. But of course, there's the other side of the coin, too.
Those who believe that government intervention stifles innovation.
They'd say price controls would ultimately harm patients in the long run because companies wouldn't have the incentive to invest in research and development.
Fewer new treatments, basically.
Yeah.
So, Shkreli, whether he intended to or not, became a symbol for both sides of this incredibly complex issue.
He did. And his case really pushed the conversation into the spotlight, more so than I think a lot of other events.
It forced people to confront some uncomfortable questions about healthcare, capitalism, the ethics of profiting off of people's need for essential medications.
It did. And it's still a debate that rages on today.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about Daraprim, the wider implications.
Okay.
Let's zoom in a bit on the specifics of Shkreli's legal troubles, the securities fraud convictions, right?
Right. Those stemmed from his actions while managing two hedge funds, MSMB Capital and MSMB Healthcare.
Okay, so what exactly did he do? What landed him in so much hot water?
Well, to put it simply, he was misleading investors about how those hedge funds were performing, painting a much rosier picture than reality. Yeah, and he was also accused of using funds from one company to pay off debts in another, like we talked about earlier, that whole Ponzi-like scheme.
Right, that financial house of cards.
Yeah.
So help me connect the dots here. How exactly do Shkreli's actions fit into that pattern?
So remember, in a classic Ponzi scheme, you're using money from new investors to pay off the older ones, creating this illusion of profit, making it seem sustainable when it's not.
Right.
And according to court documents and the Department of Justice, that's basically what Shkreli was doing. He was using money from new investors to cover losses in his funds and to pay off earlier investors who were demanding returns.
Basically robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Exactly. And all the while assuring everyone that his funds were performing exceptionally well. This web of deception went on for years, from 2009 to 2014, before it all finally unraveled.
A massive betrayal of trust.
It is. And it had a devastating impact on a lot of his investors. Some of them lost their life savings. It really underscores how financial fraud can have such far-reaching consequences. It impacts, not just the wealthy, but everyday people who are entrusting their hard-earned money to someone they believe is reputable.
Yeah, absolutely. During his trial, Shkreli's defense team tried to paint this picture of him as a misunderstood genius. Someone so focused on making money that he didn't even realize the harm he was causing. Did that argument hold any weight with the jury?
Well, his lawyer actually compared him to an oddball genius. They argued that in the end, his investors actually made money, so no harm, no foul, basically. Tried to portray him as unconventional, but ultimately, a well-intentioned businessman.
Okay.
The prosecution, of course, had a very different take. They argued that Shkreli was motivated purely by greed, a desire to enrich himself at the expense of everyone else.
And ultimately, the jury sided with the prosecution.
They did. He was found guilty on 8 counts of securities fraud. They weren't buying the defense's attempts to soften his image or downplay his actions.
So, convicted, sentenced to prison, you'd think that would be the end of it, right? But Shkreli, even behind bars, he manages to keep making headlines.
He does.
What were some of the things he did to stay in the public eye?
Well, there was that whole incident where he tried to sell the Wu-Tang Clan album on eBay while he was incarcerated.
Oh, right. He said he needed to raise money for his legal defense.
That was his claim, but the court quickly stepped in and blocked the sale. And then, if I remember correctly, there was that time he was accused of running a pharmaceutical company from his prison cell.
Wait, really?
Yeah, allegedly using a contraband cell phone to conduct making hiring decisions, still trying to exert control over his ventures.
Wow. So he lands himself in solitary confinement.
Not surprisingly.
It's like he couldn't resist pushing boundaries, even when facing some pretty serious consequences.
There's that defiance, that refusal to conform. It's a constant throughout his story.
And his online presence never really went away, did it?
Nope. He stayed active on social media, found new platforms to share his opinions, engage in debates, and, of course, continue trolling his critics.
He always finds a way.
He does. Even from prison, he managed to maintain some kind of presence in the digital world.
Okay, so we've got the legal battles, the prison antics, the online persona. But there's another piece of this puzzle I think is worth exploring, his relationship with the media.
Oh, that's a big one. It's a complex relationship, to say the least.
It's like he craved the spotlight, but then would lash out when he didn't like the way he was being portrayed.
He did. It seems like he saw the media as both a tool for self-promotion and a source of constant scrutiny and criticism. A necessary evil in his mind, I guess.
And he was pretty good at manipulating the media, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. He knew how to play the game.
Leaking information, staging events, using social media to bypass traditional news outlets.
He was a master at controlling the narrative, shaping public perception. He understood the 24-hour news cycle, how to use that to his advantage.
And all of this was before fake news, and the widespread distrust of traditional media became such a big issue.
Exactly. He was, in a way, a forerunner of the media landscape we see today, where truth can be so fluid and everyone has their own version of reality.
It's kind of amazing how his story foreshadows so many of the challenges we're grappling with now.
It does. It makes his story all the more relevant, all the more thought-provoking.
Okay, so as we head into the final stretch of our deep dive into Martin Shkreli, let's zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. What can we learn from this guy's rise and fall? What are the lasting implications of his story? It's like this unshakable belief in his own genius almost allows him to justify anything, even when it's clearly, harmful to others.
Right. It's like this core part of who he is, this belief that he's just playing by a different set of rules.
Smarter than everyone else.
Exactly. And that belief system, it lets him rationalize behavior that most people would consider unethical, even criminal.
It's cognitive dissonance.
Right.
Holding those two contradictory beliefs at the same time.
Yeah. He believes he's brilliant and innovative, but at the same time, he's engaging in deception and manipulation.
So, is it an act? Is this calculated? Or is he just that self-deluded?
Honestly, it's tough to say for sure. I think it's probably a combination of things.
Okay, yeah.
There's definitely some narcissism there, a lack of empathy, but there's also a strategic element to how he's crafted this public image.
It's like he's weaponized his intelligence.
Yeah, in a way, he has. And it's something we see with other controversial figures, too. Think about those tech CEOs who believe they can disrupt entire industries without any regard for regulations or ethics.
Oh, yeah.
Or politicians who exploit populist rhetoric to gain power, even if it means undermining democratic institutions.
It's a pattern, right? These charismatic figures with grand visions, and they're willing to bend or even break the rules to get what they want.
Exactly.
And often, it's the most vulnerable who end up paying the price for that ambition.
Always. The patients who can't afford those life-saving medications. The investors who lose their life savings. The citizens who are misled by propaganda and misinformation. They're the ones left picking up the pieces.
So the question becomes, how do we protect ourselves from these types of figures? How do we, spot the difference between a true visionary and a con artist?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it starts with education. Teaching critical thinking skills, media literacy, ethical reasoning. We have to equip people with the tools to see through the charisma, the grand promises, and recognize manipulation for what it is.
It's about being discerning, right?
Exactly. Questioning motives, demanding transparency. We can't just be seduced by that myth of the lone genius operating outside the rules.
We have to hold people accountable.
Yes, no matter how smart they are, how brilliant they seem.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Martin Shkreli, well, I gotta say, I'm left with more questions than answers. Grifter, gifted, visionary, villain. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the answer is somewhere in the gray area. He's undeniably intelligent, capable, but also deeply flawed, driven by self-interest, and it seems like he just lacks empathy.
A walking contradiction.
He is, and his story, it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ambition, about ethics, about the power of wealth and fame.
Cautionary tale, for sure.
It is a reminder that brilliance without empathy, well, that can be a dangerous and destructive force.
It makes you think.
It does.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into the enigma that is Martin Shkreli. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone, and until next time, keep questioning everything.